So I think since I'm already up here, I'll go ahead and introduce that we've got Dr. Lisa Ryder here, who's going to be talking about the new biologics and emerging JM treatments. And Dr. Ryder has, not only a bright and talented researcher that's been recognized with many honors and awards at National Institutes of Health, but then she goes and manages the George Washington University clinic that we've had over at GWU since 2006. And I think you've attended every one of these conferences when we started inviting the doctors to attend. That she's, I think, attended all of them except for one. And the one that she missed was because of her son, and he had something going on there. So welcome, Lisa, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Like for Anne, this is always, for me, the most inspiring meeting of the year, to be here with you, all of you, and all the work that you're doing. I'm so inspired by it, and all your children. So thank you. So I'm actually going to talk today not just about new biologics, but about really where we've been with treatment in the past, where we are today, and where we're going. So I'd like to first start with what are our treatment objectives for juvenile myositis. And currently, our first goal with our treatments really is to eliminate the inflammation on treatment, the active disease process. Our second goal is to try to titrate the medications down to the absolute minimal, but still keep the disease under complete control. Our third goal on the green bar is then to achieve remission, to really be able to come off medicine and keep the disease completely quiet and not there. And then, of course, our final goal that we're all aspiring to is to cure this disease. And we hope that we can make it there with all of your efforts. So really, our treatments for many, many years have been high-dose daily oral corticosteroids. It's our first line and our mainstay of treatment. I just want to give you a historical perspective for a minute that before we started to use steroids in the mid-1950s to early 1960s, our outcomes were extremely poor. 1/3 of our patients died. 1/3 survived with significant disability. They were often wheelchair-bound and had extensive calcinosis, and only 1/3 of the patients recovered. After that, we started to use high-dose daily oral corticosteroids, prednisone, and patients would take this for 18 to 24 months or longer. And these steroids really have been life-saving. So first, I might say one of the reasons that we use these very high doses, as you heard from Dr. Reed too, one reason is that patients did better on higher dose, as indicated in the red bars on the graph as compared to the blue bars. The red bars, those patients had less calcinosis. The second thing you already heard from Dr. Reed is if we catch people earlier and can recognize the disease early and get started with the treatment early, they also seem to do better. They also seem to have even less calcinosis if we would do those treatments early. So steroids have been life-saving. Our mortality after we started this approach dropped to less than 10%, and patients soon were doing better. But as you know, steroids are our best friend and our worst enemy. They have many intolerable side effects. And I think I don't have to go through this slide in detail because this is what you live with when your child was first diagnosed, for sure. As you know, there can be weight gain and mood changes and irritability and mood phases, high blood sugar, high blood pressure, fluid retention, thinning of the extremities of the skin, of the bones, etc. And really also we have concerns about long-term steroid use too. Things like cataracts, growth failure, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, potential risk factors for later problems with the heart and the blood vessels. And so we really don't like to use so many steroids. We like to get down on them. Well, fortunately, over the last few decades, a lot of new medicines have been introduced. Really, we've gotten these medicines from other diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or other types of autoimmune diseases, even transplantation to suppress the immune system. And these medicines have been tried in patients with myositis, with juvenile myositis, in very small studies. Some of them are retrospective, some of them are open label, but very small, but we could see that they're working. And based on that, they've been used, particularly in patients who don't respond to steroids alone. And I won't go through all the details of these slides, but just to say that there are a number of medication options today now that will help us spare the steroids. Well, one of the things that really became an advance in the treatment was that we realized that early introduction of methotrexate and even these other medicines really helped a lot in sparing the steroids. So from work that we're doing with our childhood myositis heterogeneity study registry, and it's Dr. Takayuki Kishi in our group of pediatric rheumatologists from Japan, and you're actually helping to support some of this work, we are learning that really there was a break point. In 1997, people started to use more of these other medicines, particularly methotrexate and some of the others. And once people started using more medicines, patients were able to taper down more rapidly on their prednisone. So instead of being on a median dose, the dose of prednisone a median of 20 months or longer, they were now able to come off or down more rapidly in 10 months. Dr. Brian Feldman in Toronto also did a study that he took patients and started all of his patients on methotrexate right at the beginning of illness. And he compared them to a group that he had treated in the years before who only got treated with prednisone alone. And he also was able to show that the patients who started methotrexate right at the beginning could come down in 10 months on their prednisone, off it actually, as opposed to 27 months for the people who got only the prednisone. And those patients that started the methotrexate right at the beginning also had less steroid side effects. They had better growth, less cataracts, just less steroid side effects. So now with our current approaches, not only are we able to come down off the prednisone or on much lower doses more quickly, but we're able to reduce the mortality as well. It's down, as you heard from Dr. Reed, to under 2% today. So a lot of better outcomes. And you already heard from Dr. Reed that even though we have all these new medications, we still have a problem that we don't have standardization. So and she already pointed out that first, in the first part of the graph, that with all these new medicines, instead of having just one solid bar all the way across, we have all these different colors, meaning people, experienced pediatric rheumatologists who are very experienced in the treatment of these diseases, they're actually using various different combinations of these medicines. It's not a standard approach. And then same for the prednisone. Some patients are getting high dose, some are getting low dose, some are getting pulses, some are getting a mixture. And again, not one solid approach, variations all the way across. So as Dr. Reed already mentioned, this group, CARA, came together with a very expert, a small expert group in juvenile myositis. This work was led by Dr. Adam Huber, and came up with 3 treatment protocols to say how should patients be treated right from the beginning, particularly patients with moderate or severe disease. And the thought was that every patient should get high-dose prednisone right from the beginning, along with methotrexate. And that was based on that other data that I showed you already. And then we would give option that some patients would also be pulsed with methylprednisolone, as shown in the top group A, option A, and some would be pulsed with methylprednisolone or even also receive intravenous gamma globulin right at the beginning. And we'd leave it up to the doctor to individualize with the patient these 3 options. But that brought much more standardization to the treatments. The CARA group, also under Dr. Huber, led through a consensus process the ability to taper down on the prednisone more rapidly, so that we hope that if your child is doing well, that you might even come off the prednisone within a year. And this is the hope, although it doesn't work for all patients. The other big advance that came along in the last year, it was published this past year, was a very large international trial from the Printo group, which is based in Europe. And in this trial, they took patients right from the beginning of illness and randomized them to receive prednisone alone, prednisone with cyclosporin in the green bar, or prednisone with methotrexate. And they wanted to see which of these 3 treatments worked best. And what they saw was that the prednisone alone really didn't respond as well in the blue bar to either the prednisone with cyclosporin or the prednisone with methotrexate. And they found that patients who received both, either methotrexate or cyclosporin right from the beginning, were ones that could discontinue their prednisone much earlier and even were more likely to enter remission later in the disease process. And they also saw that patients who received methotrexate as opposed to cyclosporin had fewer side effects. So the recommendation from this very, very important study is that patients receive methotrexate with their prednisone right from the beginning, and that this would give us the best outcomes for treatment. So this now is really the standard of care. So what if your child doesn't do according to the books and respond completely to these very best treatments? Although we've made a lot of progress, that doesn't help every single patient later in the course. Sometimes more things are needed. And remember, we have a lot of the other medicines that were put up on the slides before that we still have a lot of choices. But now we're moving into an area to try to target new treatments, something called biologic therapies. These are often proteins, but can be DNA, sugars, or even cell-based treatments. And they're more mechanism or pathway-based. They're trying to be more precise and less sledgehammer, trying to take the work that Dr. Reed described and really understand how can we target these very specific pathways that are really involved in the disease and give something more personalized to your child. They have the potential for less side effects, but remember, there are no free rides with medicine. Everything has the potential for some side effects. So I just want to point out some of the pathways that these things are targeting. First, they might be targeting T cells at the top, which are an important immune cell that activates other immune cells. They can activate macrophages that can secrete cytokines or hormones in the immune system that are driving inflammation. They can also activate B cells, the blue cells, that produce the autoantibodies that Dr. Reed talked about. And these different immune cells then are the ones that are responsible for the muscle inflammation downstream. So we are trying to target these cells. And the first target that we started with, a very successful target that Dr. Reed described, but I'd like to tell you a little more about that trial, is the one that targeted the B cell called rituximab. So as Dr. Reed described, then there was a very large trial that was conducted through the IMAX group, and it became the RIM trial investigators. It was led by Dr. Otis and Dr. Reed. This was a very large multi-center trial in which 200 patients enrolled, and 48 of those patients had juvenile dermatomyositis. The others had adult dermato and polymyositis. And these patients were looked at. Some were treated early. They got treatment in the first 0 and 1 weeks of the study. And others waited to receive that treatment. They were treated at weeks 8 and 9. And the goal of this study was to see if the patients who were treated early would respond sooner than those who were treated later. And unfortunately, that main goal was not met in this study, in that both patients who started the treatment early and late responded at about the same time, at about 20 weeks after the treatment was given. However, the patients with juvenile dermatomyositis, the smaller group of patients, the subgroup, seemed to respond a little bit earlier, but this was really not statistically different. So altogether, we couldn't say that they responded earlier. However, one of the good outcomes of this trial is that 83% of the patients responded to this treatment ultimately out in time. And these were patients that hadn't responded to other treatments. They still had very active disease despite receiving prednisone and methotrexate and even other agents. So they did respond to rituximab later on. Some other studies were done as part of this study to show that really subgroups of patients responded very well. So we did some more detailed studies in the patients that we saw at the National Institutes of Health, and were able to show that the patients improved quite a bit in their muscle strength and their function, in their ratings of their tiredness, in their quality of life and in other systems like the constitutional system, GI, pulmonary, and extramuscular. I like to talk about this as the grandmother's statistical test. You don't need a statistician to see that there was a dramatic improvement in the patients. The skin activity also improved quite significantly in the larger cohort of patients. In this trial, the other important things that we saw are that patients were able to reduce their steroid dose. Their disease was getting quieter, and the dose overall was able to be reduced. And then we had a handful of patients who flared before the trial was over, and they qualified to be retreated. And 8 of those 9 patients actually responded again to the retreatment. So that also suggested that the drug was really working. We didn't see that many side effects with this drug. The most common ones were infusion reactions, infection, and some low blood counts. So it was fairly well tolerated, this new medicine. And then there were other analyses that showed that, again, that subgroups of patients seemed to respond. So one of them is that, I showed you that earlier, that the juvenile group, the group in red, seemed to respond more quickly to the treatment and more to the treatment than the adult patients who received it. And those who had less damage or scarring at the start of the trial also were ones who responded better to this medicine. The other group that responded quite well that Dr. Reed spoke about were certain patients who had some of these myositis autoantibodies, the markers in the blood that seem to mark subgroups of patients with different clinical manifestations. So patients with JO1 and MI2 and some of the other antibodies, the ones that Dr. Reed talked about that have the very high interferon chemokine scores, these are some of the ones that responded best to the treatments. So we were able to develop some predictors about who could really respond well to rituximab. So rituximab then is very effective for juvenile dermatomyositis by the totality of the information that we learned from this trial. And it seems to work for a variety of manifestations of the disease. It seems to work particularly well for patients with these myositis autoantibodies and for patients with less damage or scarring at the beginning of the disease. And it takes a while to work. It can take 20 weeks to work. So 4 months, and people are thinking, my child got rituximab, but I don't see the benefit. But you have to wait a long time to see that benefit. And the benefit can wear off over time as the B cells are repopulated over a longer period of time. Sometimes patients even may need to be retreated. And the final point is that this medicine is fairly well tolerated. So this is our first big success in this pathway approach to the development of new biologic treatments for myositis. So after this, we have things that are more in a research phase. So the next treatment that's being looked at is one called abatacept, or CTLA-4 Ig. And this medicine is targeting the T cells, the green cells at the very top of the graph I showed you a few slides back. There are certain activation molecules on lymphocytes, B cells and T cells. They have certain letters. We won't have to go into the spellings here. And they're expressed on these lymphocytes or immune cells, and they're also expressed on very low levels on the muscle cells that are the target of the inflammation in myositis. We know that these levels are increased in patients, adult patients with dermato and polymyositis. They seem to be upregulated, if you will. And we know that this abatacept binds to some of these markers on the antigen-presenting cells, the B cells and the muscle cells, and it blocks the T cell from being activated. So that's how it's helping to dampen down the immune system. There are reports, only case reports, including one report of a juvenile dermatomyositis patient who had significant benefit after receiving this abatacept treatment. And now we have preliminary results from a trial conducted in Sweden in adult and poly and dermatomyositis patients that suggests that patients improve after receiving this treatment who hadn't responded well to other treatments. So now we have a trial being conducted at George Washington University, the abatacept in juvenile dermatomyositis trial. And this study is trying to assess the safety and efficacy of abatacept in a small group of patients with juvenile dermatomyositis. Patients need to have moderately active disease and have failed prednisone and one other treatment, and they have to be at least 7 years of age. And all the patients who come to this study will receive this treatment as a weekly injection under the skin and be able to be monitored very closely through questionnaires, through blood testing, MRIs, and other things. And everybody will have 6 months of treatment in the study. So that's a possible opportunity for patients who aren't doing well. There will also be studies in adult patients, a large adult trial that will start later this year as well, of this same medicine. There are several other medicines also in trials or in development in the testing phase, trying to see if they work for patients with adult dermatom and polymyositis. So the first one is called tocilizumab. This is one that binds a cytokine or immune hormone that's pro-inflammatory, and it will bind that and block it from activating cells. This one is being studied in adult dermato and polymyositis in a multi-center study. It's a placebo-controlled trial, so some patients won't receive the active medicine in the trial. And it is open also to adult patients who have juvenile dermatomyositis. There are several others, and I won't go through them all, but an interesting one that's being studied is one called tocilizumab, and this is actually a targeted drug treatment. This treatment is targeting a particular signaling molecule called a JAK kinase that sits inside this cell, but it binds to the receptors of the hormone called interferon. And this is the hormone Dr. Reed described that's very highly upregulated in the patients with juvenile dermatomyositis. So we're pretty excited about the possibility of this trial being one that might really be helpful in the future and one that will keep our eyes out. And there are a number of other treatment trials going on that are currently open to adult patients. Sometimes the safety of medicines needs to be first tested in adults, and if they work very well in adults, then we might be interested to try this in patients with juvenile dermatomyositis in the future. So Jim Minow described earlier about a very exciting new approach also to develop new treatments. And this is through the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, or endcaps. This is a laboratory at NIH that is screening large numbers of drug compounds and trying to look at their effectiveness for different diseases. The importance of your funding this work is that now a postdoctoral fellow in this very experienced laboratory will be dedicated to working very specifically on juvenile myositis. First, what has to happen is that certain assays in the test tube have to be developed that really give us the important readouts of the molecular processes going on in the disease. One of the most important readouts we know is the one that Dr. Reed described, that interferon pathway. So we know that will be a very important readout, and there are probably other important readouts for the disease. So one of the first things that this program is going to do is really be able to design in the test tube some assays that can give important future readouts about the molecular pathways in the disease. The next thing that this program probably will be able to do is take the drugs that we currently use to treat juvenile dermatomyositis and test them in the test tube to see how they're working in these pathways. And that might, in the future, help us really target much better which of our patients should get these medicines and might be more likely to respond. So that's going to be another very important readout of this program. And the final thing is that they're going to be able to screen thousands of chemicals and biologics and other compounds. And this picture here is the laboratory. These are the very large robots that they have, and they have cabinets full of these drugs in different plates. And then what they do is once we have the assays worked out, then they can plate those assays on these plates and plate all these different compounds to test many at once and then look at the biologic effectiveness of these different compounds. So we hope that there might be the possibility to develop some new medicines through this approach. anything that would be developed would then need to be tested in patients down the road. So in summary then, where have we been? Well, we've come very far, actually. We have prednisone as the mainstay of treatment now that has enabled survival and less disability of our patients. We've introduced other medicines, particularly methotrexate, but many others, that have allowed less prednisone to be used and further enhanced the survival and functional ability of our patients. Now we're just beginning to have some standardization in the treatment approaches that we're using to treat patients with juvenile myositis. And we're just beginning the path to start on targeted biologic therapies, with our first big success being rituximab treatment, but we hope others are coming down the road. Finally, an interesting new program to develop new targeted treatments through pathway assay development and this very large screening of large numbers of chemical compounds. And all of this is helping us toward the path to cure juvenile myositis. So I'd like to thank those that work on all of this work, particularly first the Environmental Autoimmunity Group at NIEHS, and I'd like people to stand that are here. Dr. Fred Miller is the chief of our group, but Dr. Takayuki Kishi from Japan, the GW Myositis Clinic, Dr. Gulnara Mamarova, and Dr. Michelle Best and Simonetta D'Onofrio. And we have our parent volunteers, Michelle Best and Simonetta D'Onofrio, who are here. Hannah Kim is a pediatric rheumatologist in NIAMS. I don't know if she's here. Okay, and then we have these collaborative groups. The work could not be possible without the scientists working together. So we have CARA, Printo, IMAX, the Childhood Myositis Heterogeneity Group, the rituximab and myositis trial. We have our funders of the work. The partnership with CureJM has been so important, and all the patients and their families, all the dedication. So thank you so much. Thank you.